any. Oh, put these right here. Don't want to promote them. I want to. I'm gonna eat one more thing of chips. Should have did that before I put start. I didn't think this through. Okay, can you hear on the live? On the live, can you hear? We've been having some headphone problems. Then also, there we go. The speaker's working. And it sort of feels like looks too arrogant. Like I feel like I need two mics. I don't feel like I need two mics. However, we have.
You don't have to hold for it to hear you.
Yeah, that's true. I probably could like sit it down. All right. Let me know how the audio sounds. We are here for Food Truck Tuesday protest. What week is this? It's like week 18, 19? I don't know what week it is. Lost count of the weeks. Yeah, if anybody's watching this at home, just let us know if the audio's working. This is beginning of production. Pre-production. YouTube won't have this version of the video. All right, so what we have regularly done when we come out to the city hall, when we come out to Food Truck Tuesdays, has been to bring pamphlets of the history of the Winnebago County Task Force, which has events that have taken place surrounding police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice inside of them. We have read from the stories inside of this pamphlet, which is something that we'll continue to do today as well. We have brought signs of some of the victims of police terrorism in the city of Rockford, Illinois. This is Denzel Duvant, who was assaulted at the hands of the Rockford Police Department. Assaulted at the hands of the Rockford Police Department on January 5th, 2021. This is Faustin Guaitigo, who was murdered on April 10th, 2021, by the Winnebago by the Winnebago County Sheriff deputies. This is Jose Gonzalez Jr., 19 years old. He was shot by the Rockford Police Department while he was running away. This happened on April 11th, 2021. And then also on April 25th, 2021, Raymond Jackson died after a high-speed pursuit took place on the streets of Rockford, Illinois. And so those are four names that are not included inside of this pamphlet. But what we will do now is go through some of the names that are included inside of this pamphlet. Mark Barmore, murdered August 24th, 2009 by the Rockford Police Department. Michael Sago Jr., murdered October 1st, 2011 by off-duty Winnebago County Sheriff deputies. Philip Johnson, murdered January 28th, 2012 by the Rockford Police Department. Logan Bell, murdered October 11th, 2012 by the Rockford Police Department. Demetrius Bennett, murdered November 1st, 2012 by the Rockford Police Department. Eddie Patterson, murdered November 5th, 2017 by the Rockford Police Department. Kerry Blake, murdered December 30th, 2018 by the Rockford Police Department. Gino Washington, killed October 28th, 2019 inside the Winnebago County Jail. Joseph McCormick, killed December 1st, 2019 inside the Winnebago County Jail. Mikey Guzman, ran down August 23rd, 2020 by a South Beloit Police Department officer. And then Tyrus Jones, shot October 2nd, 2020 by the Rockford Police Department. So those are the names that are included in the history of the Winnebago Boone County Integrity Task Force pamphlet. Again, this is a pamphlet that we have routinely brought out here, and we have routinely used to read from, to shine light on the issues of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice in Winnebago County. Let's go through and read from August 24th, 2009, the incident concerning the murder of Mark Barmore. During the late morning on August 24th, 2009, a woman called the Rockford Police Department alleging that Mark Anthony Barmore had threatened to slash her throat the previous night. According to dispatch records, the woman stated that Barmore was sleeping inside and that she would wait outside for police. Units were dispatched and arrived on scene between 10 to 15 minutes after the initial call, but did not apprehend Barmore, reporting that he fled out the back door of the residence. A few minutes later, a Rockford police dispatcher notified patrol units that a person called, quote, Skip, end quote, fitting the description of the individual for whom police were looking, was seen walking on the Jefferson Street Bridge on Rockford's west side. Dispatch notified units that Skip had apparently pulled a knife out on a girl. Officers North and Poole were assigned to the squadron wagon for Rockford's west side. The officers were dispatched to the Jefferson Street Bridge. 5 minutes after officers North and Poole were assigned to respond to the Jefferson Bridge, dispatch provided more detailed information about the person for whom they were searching, including his name, a more complete physical description, and that Barmore was wanted on a warrant and might still be armed with a knife. A few minutes after receiving this information, officers North and Poole notified dispatch that they had Barmore in sight in the Winnebago Woodlawn area. The evidence shows that officers North and Poole saw Barmore standing outside the House of Grace Church talking with a group of people. According to several of these individuals, Barmore, who came to the church occasionally, was relaying trouble he was having, including an altercation with the girl where, quote, he almost had to slit her throat, end quote, resulting in the police coming after him. Church members and officials were encouraging him to stay out of trouble and become involved in a boxing group the church was soon to begin. When Barmore saw officers North and Poole and realized they were looking for him, he ran from the group and into the church, slipping in behind a church official who was entering the church. Officer Poole got out of the police vehicle and pursued Barmore, while Officer North drove the vehicle to the side of the building to prevent Barmore from fleeing through the side doors of the church. The doors to the church were locked, but Officer Poole was led into the church by a church official. Two women in the church told Officer Poole that the man had gone downstairs and that there were children in the basement. A young man held the door open for Officer North and also told him that Barmore had gone downstairs. Officer North went downstairs with Officer Poole right behind him. According to Officer North's statement to RPD, he drew his service weapon just before entering the daycare room at the bottom of the basement stairs. And so this is the first moment that I'll interject here. So this is the mind state that these police officers are in. They have chased this man into a church. They've now chased him into the daycare inside of the church. And as they are entering the daycare inside of the church, where they know children are present, they're unholstering their weapons. This is the point in which they believe they need to bring their weapons out and that their weapons should be unholstered. And again, that is because of the mentality that these officers have, where catching their suspect is more important than preserving human life, even if the human life is not the suspect that they are after. And so everybody who is in the vicinity in this daycare, which consists of children majority, all of these people are now in danger, in much more danger now because that these officers have pulled out weapons than they were from just somebody running into there to run away from the police. So I think that that's something that's important to note. Let's continue reading through here. Officer Poole, according to his statement, had drawn his weapon while in the hallway of the church upstairs. When officers North and Poole entered the daycare room in the basement, they immediately saw somewhere between 8 and 15, quote, about preschool age, end quote, children in their estimation, as well as about 2 adults. At least one child in the daycare classroom in the basement saw Barmore enter the classroom and run past the counter through a small kitchen area into what was known as the boiler room or closet. Officer North was the first one to enter the daycare room in the basement and asked, quote, Where did he go? End quote. Or words to that effect. One or more children and possibly the daycare teacher stated that he had gone into the closet. Sheila Brown, a pastor of the Sheila Brown, a pastor of the House of Grace Church and proprietor of the daycare, had followed the officers into the basement. Seeing officers' guns drawn, she and the daycare teacher already in the room gathered the children into the corner of the classroom opposite the boiler room and shielded the kids with their bodies. Upon being told that Barmore had entered the boiler room, Officer North focused his attention on the boiler room door, which had a small window in the center at about Officer North's eye level. Because it was dark inside the room, Officer North activated his gun-mounted flashlight. Officer Poole entered the basement during this time and was right behind Officer North as Officer North immediately began to try to open the boiler room door. Officers North and Poole stated that they attempted to push the door open, but Barmore was pushing the door back, quote, attempting to barricade the door closed, end quote, in the words of Officer Poole. Witness and officer statements report that the officers yelled at Barmore to come out of the closet, get down, and to put his hands up. Officers North and Poole were able to open the door a few inches at first, and then approximately 12 inches, all while Barmore was attempting to keep the door closed. Barmore reached out and grabbed a long white object, later determined to be a metal ballast cover, at which point officers North and Poole were able to force open the door, pushing Barmore back into the boiler room and causing him to drop the ballast cover. And then let's, I think it's important to note here too, now there's multiple opportunities that these officers could take a moment and pause, have the children that are in the daycare removed, have the teachers that are also in the daycare and in harm's way removed. They could have called someone in to engage in crisis intervention. These are all things that are options and available to them, but they chose to not do those things in this situation. Not simply because these individuals were bloodthirsty, but because the institution which they operate in is bloodthirsty, and that institutional bloodthirstiness seeps into individuals, so that when they when they are in events such as this, it is more than just the individual actions that are being displayed. It's also the institutional ideology that is being displayed as these actions take place. So just as culpable as we're reading through this, just as culpable as Oda Poole and Stan North are, the Rockford Police Department is just as, if not more culpable, for the fact that they have created Oda Poole and Stan North, and they created multiple Oda Pooles and Stan Norths before Oda Poole and Stan North, and they have continued in the creation of Oda Pooles and Stan Norths. Officers North and Poole were able to open the door a few inches at first, and then approximately 12 inches, all while Barmore was attempting to keep the door closed. Barmore reached out and grabbed a long white object, later determined to be a metal ballast cover, at which point officers North and Poole were able to force open the door, pushing Barmore back into the boiler room and causing him to drop the cover. While the officers' statements are ambiguous on this point, it appears that the officers may actually have pursued Barmore into the boiler room. The boiler room, which was 15 feet wide by approximately 33 feet long, was not illuminated except by Officer North's gun-mounted flashlight and any light reaching it from the daycare classroom. According to officer statements, Officers North then stepped back to, quote, extend the distance, end quote, between himself and Barmore. Officer Poole held his pistol, quote, in a close quarters combat style hold, end quote, close to his chest, and remained either inside or at the doorway of the boiler room very close to Barmore. According to the officer's statements, the reason for maintaining this close proximity to Barmore was to keep Barmore from retreating back into the boiler room from where he might, quote, get away, end quote, and take hostages or otherwise cause harm. And now, again, I believe it's important to point out and to interject in here, too. If Barmore wanted to take hostages, if that was something that he was in a desire to do, he had an ample opportunity when he interacted with all of these children and all of these teachers or the people watching these children before the police officers did. One of the things that happens is after the fact, police officers will, police departments, institutions, state's attorneys as well, will find all of these things that were possibilities or had a chance of happening, and use those possibilities against the actuality of what happened. And the actuality of what happened is that Mark Barmore showed no interest in taking hostages. Mark Barmore did nothing that would be considered displaying that he had a willingness or a desire to take hostages. But once Barmore had been murdered and they had killed him because of the bloodthirstiness that they had, then they added this possibility into the equation. An act to further criminalize a man that they have already murdered. An act to make it seem as if even though they've already victimized him, it's done in an act to make him seem like less of a victim. Officer North indicates that Barmore first reached for Officer Poole's service weapon with one hand, then with two. Officer Poole states that Barmore immediately, quote, lunged for his weapon, quote, with both hands, end quote. So already there, both of these officers have different remembrances of how the gun was reached for, if the gun was even actually reached for. And the fact that they don't remember this situation, something that is this arbitrary, something that I would think something that should be very memorable, since they don't remember these things in coordination with each other, it points to the fact that it's very likely a possibility that he never lunged for their weapon, that this was something that they both just said in an attempt to excuse the murdering of Mark Barmore. In either event, both officers reported that very quickly, both Officer Poole and Barmore had both hands on Officer Poole's gun. Barmore, with both hands on the barrel of the gun, and Officer Poole with one hand on the gun, with one hand on the gun grip and one hand over Barmore's hands. Officer Poole and Barmore struggled over the gun while, quote, within inches, end quote, of each other, and with the gun at chest level. Officer Poole reported that he believed that Barmore was struggling to disarm him, and that if Barmore were to succeed, Barmore might use the weapon against one of the officers. Officer Poole reported that when he was able to push the barrel of the weapon towards Barmore, he pulled the trigger and saw the bullet strike Barmore in the neck. Officer Poole reported that after being shot, Barmore moved back and then forward again, maintaining his hold on the gun. Okay, and so now, again, this officer wants you to believe that after shooting a man point blank in the neck, that the man held on to the gun with the same grip and continued to struggle for it. Officer Poole and Barmore continued to struggle, falling against the sink with their backs to Officer North. Officer Poole reported that he heard Officer North discharge his weapon, at which point he was able to pull his gun away from Barmore. Officer Poole reported that he saw Barmore fall, quote, against the sink and then fall to the floor, landing on his back, end quote. Officer Poole reported that Officer North then broadcast over the police radio a call for officer assistance and medical attention for Barmore. At this point, according to Officer Poole, he yelled to the daycare teachers to take the children from the room. So after they murdered somebody in front of the children, after they put the children's lives at risk, after they've permanently psychologically traumatized these children, now they think it's important to get the children removed from the room. Again, that's because of the bloodthirstiness. Now that they've quenched their thirst for blood, now they're thinking about other human beings and considering the children that are in this situation that they just murdered somebody in front of. Officer North reported that once he saw that Officer Poole and Barmore were struggling over Officer Poole's gun, he, quote, instantly realized this had now turned into a life or death situation for Officer Poole, myself, and possibly the room if Barmore was allowed to get Officer Poole's pistol. Okay, 1 second. Officer North reported that as he waited for Officer Poole to get out of his line of fire, he heard Officer Poole's gun discharge. Officer North reported that he did not know who had fired the gun, who had been hit, or who was in control of the gun. Officer North reported that as Barmore's right rear side faced him, he aimed at Barmore's back and fired what he believed to be 3 or 4 rounds, striking Barmore's back. And that has been a commonality as well, these officers shooting people in the back. Officer North reports that Barmore fell to the floor, landing on his back, and that water from a pipe near the seat began spraying water. At this point, according to Officer North, there was now a lot of screaming from the children, who were now huddled in the far northeast corner of the room with the adults. As additional officers arrived on the scene, Officers North and Poole, quote, began yelling for the adult daycare workers to get the children out of there, end quote. Officer Hansel, one of the first officers arriving on the scene, placed handcuffs on Barmore without moving him. And I don't know how you can put handcuffs on somebody who's just been shot to death without moving him. And then also, that has also been a commonality with these events of police terrorism, is victims of police shootings being handcuffed after being shot by the police. As they're struggling and fighting for their life, as they are gasping their last breaths, processing their last thoughts, they are handcuffed by these police officers. Officer Hansel reported that Barmore was, quote, breathing in very ragged breaths that had several seconds between them, end quote. Officers called for an ambulance within approximately 1 minute after shots were fired. The church where the shooting occurred is across the street from a fire station, and emergency personnel were able to respond within moments of being called. Emergency personnel reported finding Barmore on his back in the kitchen area, not moving, not breathing, and pulseless. Emergency personnel asked permission from an officer to move Barmore from behind the counter to provide more room to work on him, and were given permission by the officer to move Barmore. And then that just points out again this sick mentality that everybody buys into. This the person who is the medical professional is asking a person who is not a medical professional for permission to do his job, to move this person's body. The police officers did not own Mark Barmore's body, but they have people brainwashed into thinking that they do. 1 second, I gotta throw my hoodie on. It's a slow day today.
Yeah, this gotta be the slowest day. This one of the slowest days I've ever seen out here. More people was out here when the fucking tornado was coming. Okay. I'm doing that. How you doing?
All right, let's see. Where are we at? Okay, yeah, handcuffed. Oh no, they asked for permission to move his body. Okay. Barmore was pronounced dead by emergency personnel while on the scene of the shooting. The events described above, from the moment officers North and Poole saw Barmore in front of the church to the time they discharged their weapons, shooting and killing him, occurred in just more than 2 minutes. Man, that's crazy. That's crazy. 2 minutes. I don't think I can even read through this in 2 minutes. It's the first part. Maybe I could. Okay. The forensic evidence is consistent with Officer Poole's and North's assertion that Officer Poole and Barmore were in close proximity when Officer Poole's weapon was fired, supporting the assertion that Officer Poole and Barmore were struggling over the weapon. The nature of the injury to Barmore's neck, the trajectory of the bullet, analysis of blood patterns, the presence of Barmore's DNA inside the ejection port of Officer Poole's gun, and the identification of DNA that may have been pulled underneath Barmore's fingernails are all evidence that Barmore was shot at close range. Not that he was holding on to the gun. A witness statement that Barmore stated as he was running downstairs that, quote, he was not going to go back, end quote, or words to that effect, indicate a mindset more likely to engage in struggle rather than surrender. And I don't know who gave this statement. I don't want to be disparaging to nobody, but why the hell would you tell the police that he said that? In addition, on-scene field notes by the sergeants who separately interviewed Officers North and Poole immediately after the shooting while still at the church indicate that the officers' first accounts of the events given minutes after the shooting were materially consistent with their later written supplement reports provided to RPD a few days after the incident ensued. This evidence indicates that there was a struggle over Officer Poole's weapon, and Officer Poole shot Barmore from close proximity during this struggle. Officer Poole and Officer North stated that Barmore's hands were on Officer Poole's weapon during the struggle and at the moment the weapon was fired. Upon examination of Poole's weapon, a spent cartridge casing. Damn, it is hard to keep up with this. A Sprint cartridge casing was located in the chamber, consistent with interference with the weapon while being fired. Gunshot residue analysis did not reveal gunshot residue on Barmore's hand, and Barmore's finger or handprints were not found on Officer Poole's weapon. So again, as much as some of these other things are thrown in there to try to convolute the conversation, this is evident. All this evidence that we just went through all points to how this man did not have any, did not grab for this officer's weapon. He did not have his hands on this officer's weapon. Again, these actions took place within 2 minutes. These police officers were bloodthirsty. These police officers have been trained to go for kills by the institutions that they work for. And so it was not because Barmore was trying to unarm them or use their weapons against them or because they feared Barmore would take hostages. It was because they did not value Barmore's life. It was because they had been taught tactics of violence, and so they implemented those tactics of violence on someone whose life they did not value. The forensic evidence is consistent with Officer North's statement that he shot Barmore right rear side him. The forensic evidence is consistent with Officer North's statement that he shot Barmore as Barmore's right rear side faced him, aiming at Barmore's back and firing what he believed to be 3 or 4 rounds, striking Barmore in the back. 4 cartridge casings from Officer North's gun were found. 3 of the wounds to Barmore were found to have come from Officer North's weapon. The 4th wound to Barmore was a neck wound consistent with the bullet fired from close range by Officer Poole's weapon. The trajectories of the wounds caused by bullets from Officer North's weapon, as well as analysis of blood patterns and other forensic evidence, are consistent with Officer North's description of Barmore falling and turning as he was shot. The 4th bullet appears to have struck the water pipe of the sink in the kitchen area, resulting in water spraying the area until the water to the pipe was turned off. Other than possibly the children in the basement, the only other apparent civilian witness to Officer Poole's shooting of Barmore said in the written statement she gave to RPD the day of the incident that she saw Barmore come out of the boiler room with his hands up and saw one officer shoot Barmore from about 4 feet away. And then that is something that was said to have happened in Ferguson as well, that Michael Brown was shot while he had his hands up. It gave birth to the infamous slogan, "Hands up, don't shoot." All right. Okay. Let's see. Let's go back. The only apparent civilian witness to Officer Poole's shooting of Barmore said in the written statement she gave to RPD the day of the incident that she saw Barmore come out of the boiler room with his hands up and saw one officer shoot Barmore from about 4 feet away. The witness states that she then stepped out of the doorway and heard 2 or 3 additional gunshots after that. This formal statement is consistent with the information she gave to an officer while still on scene, moments after the shooting. Later media reports quote this witness as stating that, quote, "The officer shined his flashlight into the boiler room and told him to come out. He came out real slow with his hands up and his head down, and they shot him. He fell over to the sink, he tried to get back up, and they shot him again." A heavy-set officer was the one who was shooting him while he was on the ground. And then that goes to Faustin Guaitigo. There was a video of Faustin Guaitigo. When Faustin Guaitigo was murdered, there was a video of the dash camera, of the body cameras of the Winnebago County Sheriff deputies who engaged in the hit of Faustin Guaitigo, was what it seemed like. It seemed like a hit. But one of the things that happened there was when Faustin Guaitigo was already on the ground, had already been shot, there was another, basically a kill shot fired into him by an officer. And so this is a regularity. This shooting people in the back happens regularly. This shooting people while they are on the ground happens regularly. This handcuffing of people that they have shot in the back and have shot while on the ground happens regularly. And all of these things just point to the institutional evils that exist within these within the police department out here. Oh man, no, I lost my fire. Okay. The evidence is consistent with Officer North's statement that he shot Barmore because he heard a shot. Hey, what's up? How you doing? The evidence is consistent with Officer North's statement that he shot Barmore because he heard a shot and did not know whether Officer Poole had been shot and did not know who had control of Officer Poole's weapon. The forensic evidence is consistent with Officer North's statement that he shot Barmore as Barmore's right rear side faced him, aiming at Barmore's back and firing what he believed to be 3 or 4 rounds, striking Barmore in the back. And again, like I said, the shooting in the back has been a regularity. The shooting of people running away is a regularity. The shooting of people that are on the ground is a regularity. And those are all acts of inhumaneness. Those are not acts of justice. Those are not acts of protecting and serving. Those are acts of inhumaneness. Where was that? Where was we at? Okay. Also consistent with the evidence, this witness heard 3 shots after Barmore. This witness heard 3 shots and Barmore. Also consistent with the evidence, this witness heard 3 shots after she backed away from the door. The witness's perception of the distance between the officer and Barmore may be consistent with the forensic evidence depending upon whether the witness's statement that officers were, quote, about 4 feet, end quote, from Barmore meant 4 feet from person to person or from gun to person. The forensic evidence regarding the trajectory of the initial shot does not appear to be consistent with this witness's statement. This witness later reported statements to the media are significantly different than her initial statements to police and are not supported by the forensic evidence. A second civilian witness, according to her written statement, stated that she did not see the shooting, but that she heard 4 gunshots and then turned to see an officer with his gun pointed in a downward position. Later media reports assert that this witness stated that officers, quote, fired as many as 8 rounds into Barmore, including at least 1 shot into his head, end quote. The forensic evidence is consistent with this witness's initial written statement, but not with later media reports. RPD policy authorizes an officer to use deadly force, quote, to protect himself or others from what he reasonably believes to be an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm, end quote. A preponderance of the currently available evidence indicates that at the moment deadly force was used by officers North and Poole, the use of that force was consistent with the RPD policy. However, as detailed below, the actions of Officer North and Poole leading up to the shooting violated RPD policy and were not consistent with RPD training or sound tactics. The officers' handling of this incident placed the officers and numerous civilians, including young children, at increased risk of harm. And so that is the murder of Mark Barmore by the Rockford Police Department. One of the more notorious, more infamous events of police terrorism, which has happened out here in Rockford, Illinois. And so, let's see. It is one of the things that has, it is always very difficult to read through these, especially because of the fact that all the officers who have been involved in these murders have continued to be on the police force or have retired and been paid a pension. There's just a lack of accountability for the things that these officers engage in. All right. Let's read Logan Bell. Logan Bell, age 18, was a, quote, sweet and caring young man, end quote, who suffered from a, quote, social disorder, end quote. Toxicology reports reveal he hadn't been taking medication prescribed for bipolar symptoms. His grandmother called the police, explaining that Logan had a handgun, a pellet pistol, and feared he was, quote, a danger to himself, end quote. Rockford Police Department Sergeant Andre Brass and 2 officers, Philip Statler and Jeremiah Sizzle, found Logan in the field near Pilgrim Baptist, waving the Crossman C11, the BB gun. They ordered him to put it down. Quote, shoot me, end quote, Logan replied. Quote, you're going to have to shoot me. I'm not going to drop the gun, end quote. He fired a BB at Brass, who, uninjured, tripped while retreating. And so again, all of these officers know that this young man has a BB gun. All of these officers know that they were called not because the community was in danger.
What is it? Oh,
Oh, my fault. See, that's why I don't look at the comments, because then you be looking, when you start looking at the comments, you be looking all stupid trying to see what it say. And then, all right. Okay, let's keep reading. He fired a BB at Brass, who, uninjured, but still leave comments, though. Still leave comments. That wasn't to say to not leave comments. But leave as many, bunch of comments. Leave a bunch of comments still. I'm just not going to read them. Until later. Okay. He fired a BB at Brass, who, uninjured, tripped while retreating. Statler and Sizzle hit Logan 16 times. Quote, 10 were through and through, end quote, explained Winnebago County Coroner Sue Fiducia. 3 in the head, the fatal shots through the heart and the lung. Standing in the field alongside former Alderman Victory Bell, Lloyd Johnston, president of the Rockford NAACP, and Oliver Emerson, a Pilgrim Baptist deacon, the Reverend Kenneth Board said police should have done more to talk Logan down. Quote, mental illness should not be handled with, quote, mental illness should be handled with concern and compassion, end quote, he read. Quote, as we see it, the only thing criminal here is the response, end quote. Rockford Police Chief Chet Epperson said, quote, our hearts go out to the Bell family. The officers did the best they could in a split-second situation. In our line of work, we do not have the option of choosing when and where we will become involved in deadly force, end quote, which is not true. It's not true. Nobody else has that option to decide. They have the option. The Winnebago County Integrity Task Force investigated the incident. Winnebago County State's Attorney to determine whether the use of force was justified. Illinois State Police Lieutenant Kirk Kavanaugh, who led the Integrity Task Force, determined the officers' actions to be justified. Quote, our hearts do go out to them, end quote, he said. It is very unfortunate that this had to happen. And again, that is the commonality of all of these stories in here, that they've all been ruled justified. That's the commonality of all these police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice events that have happened here, that they've all been found to be justified by the institutions that perpetuate them. I'm gonna end this one and then start another one up. I'm gonna finish these chips real quick.